Hello and happy new year everyone, this is Bonsert of Radio Retro Future. Before we get on to the main subject, this January 9th, that's next Saturday, we have a workshop writing fiction for beginners on our Discord. Link to register on this free workshop is down below in the description, together with a number of other videos that are relevant to the topic we're gonna discuss today. I don't wanna re-thread all topics again here, so I put them down in the description for you to watch. And with that being said, let's get on to the main subject. In the last video I talked about the difference between the SCP Foundation and my own project, the Association of Ishtar, for which people can also submit their own short stories, but I haven't really talked about what makes SCP work as a format in the first place, because according to all common knowledge, it shouldn't, because we're told always to do show, don't tell. Yet the SCP story structure often include a lot of tell structures. So in today's video I want to discuss why it works regardless. If you're not familiar with the SCP Foundation, go check out this video why you should read the SCP Foundation. That is about the general concept, world and lore. In this video I talk purely about the structure itself and why it is so successful, but also about its pitfalls and why applying a similar format, like in the Association of Ishtar, is harder than people think. Assuming that you know what a SCP is, I'm going through the various sections of the format and briefly discuss why these are important. If you want a briefer version of the SCP Foundation itself, go check out an article linked in the description. In general, we are always told, show, don't tell. However, when you look at the sentences of many SCPs, it's mostly tell. These are factual descriptions of anomalies and events that are in themselves not very engaging to read. At least not according to the theory. Now there are good SCPs and lesser well written SCPs, so not all of them succeed in what I am about to explain. Every SCP starts with a containment procedure. Lore-wise, these sections describe how the Foundation contains an SCP, if that's possible. Narratively, this section contains a lot of foreshadowing, a rack of Chekhov guns, if you will. The containment procedures hit at abilities the SCP has. Let's say an SCP that needs to be inside a cell with 100% cotton padding on the wall. Without context, it seems like a random measure, but later on it becomes apparent why. There's more to it than that, however. Not only is the intention to make the reader curious what the point of cotton padding is and why it needs to be replaced, it also sets the tone for the story. Although SCP are commonly known as creepypastas, some are humorous, others are horror or hard science fiction. Most are on the pulpy side, just describing a single idea. Others, however, are deconstructions of genres or human behavior. A well-written containment procedure puts the reader in the proper mindset to get properly immersed in the story. One of the most notorious containment procedures is probably that of SCP-2845. The deer. In this case, the containment procedure is about 2/3 of the entire story. The procedure contains a routine of various rituals that includes costuming, games, and finally a sacrifice. Not only does this containment procedure go from odd to worse, it reveals a sinister side to the Foundation and how far they are willing to go to contain some SCPs. Of course, this will make the readers curious what the SCP Foundation is trying to contain. But it also sets up a mystery that the reader can only solve by reading beyond the procedures. Even then, there is still plenty of research to be done to understand all the references. Next up is the description section. This is often the most descriptive section of an SCP, with factual statements about its dimensions, appearance and abilities. Sounds simple enough, but it's the most difficult to write in a compelling and memorable way. Now, I might be the minority here, but I often find myself skimming parts of this section because these contain a lot of factoids and don't really matter in the narrative scheme of things. Making up facts is easy. The greatest challenge is to write these descriptions well, especially because these are written in a tell format rather than a show format. I'll delve deeper into this later, but if I can make one recommendation, don't repeat the number of the SCP over and over again. I mean, I know it's a trope and all, but it really gets in the way of readability and just becomes white noise. especially when I'm recording audiobooks. After the description section, the format becomes more freeform. The SCP is explored in various, more narrative sections like interviews with the SCPs or witnesses, experiment logs, journals, etc. I did a video on the do and don'ts of writing journals and other topics like that, so go check out that video down in the description if you want to know more about that. Instead, I want to talk about the style of the SCPs, which is often criticized and yet makes it very popular at the same time. I have issues with the tale structure of many SCPs as well. Having judged many submissions by aspiring writers, I roll my eyes when I notice a writer using a tell sentence instead of taking the time to, well, show me what happens in a scene rather than summarize it in a single sentence. The art of writing an SCP, however, is to make the tale structure work for the story rather than against it. Good foreshadowing in the containment procedure is an example of that. One thing SCPs have going for them is their high concepts, and using tell rather than show helps you explore sci-fi or fantasy concepts in a very distilled form. In that sense, you can say SCPs are written minimalistic, but there's more to it than that. When explaining SCP to a layperson, they're often described as creepypastas, but that's only partly true. Sure, there are horror stories on the internet, often written by writers with little experience, but creepypastas are more known for their notoriety than quality. Notorious meaning that they're often very angsty, dark, wish fulfillment fantasies written with subpar ability. Most of these have disappeared inside the memory hole now, with the exception of one, Slender Man. Some even mistakenly associate this character with SCP. But that might have something to do with the media attention it got and its more minimalistic aesthetic. The popularity of Marble Hornets probably didn't hurt either. To get back on track, SCPs go beyond the often juvenile tone of creepypastas. Like all good concepts, SCPs are an exploration of ideas and how people react in certain situations. The horror doesn't just arise out of the monsters or the inclusion of body horror. It comes out of how people act when they're exposed to anomalies. The machine, SCP-914, for example, has mind-bending abilities that manipulates its victims to feed the machine every bit of metal they can get their hands on. Sounds creepy and weird, but it turns to horrific the moment all sources of metal are depleted, and, not to spoil it, let's just say the victims need to find an alternative source of metal. SCPs are often described as impersonal, which is true. However, that is by design. You see, you're not supposed to read an SCP as a typical short story, but as an experience. A roleplay, as it were, in which you play a member of the SCP Foundation, and it is your job to contain the threat which is described to you on paper. I think what makes SCP work, they spark the imagination. Good SCPs contain creatures or anomalies that put their victims in horrific circumstances that require out-of-the-box thinking to get out of. Just look up SCP-682 and all the third-party proposals on how to destroy it. That is what a lot of containment procedures are. Solutions to fantastical puzzles created by extraordinary circumstances. Some of them are not even proper solutions, but good enough propositions to at least postpone the inevitable, like one of my favorites, SCP-2399, the malfunctioning destroyer. Herein also lies its limitation, or rather, its framework. For those who watch my video, The Definition of Steampunk, I look at genres as a toolkit with a certain set of equipment to achieve a certain result. SCPs are stories that strive to make the reader feel a certain experience, be it to gross them out with body horror, make them afraid of carnivorous blankets, or to attend weddings ever again. You have an outlandish idea? Well, the SCP Foundation has a set of tools for you to use, including a story structure, tropes, and some lore. Have fun. One such tool is the beep. The blanked out texts, names, or information are a well-known trope. This can help increase some of the mystery or creepiness. But like all tools, you need to know how to use them well. What helps in this regard is that the SCP universe takes place on Earth. It's a place we're all familiar with, and many SCPs resemble objects that are usually harmless. A statue that snaps your neck, a mirror reflection that starts to stalk you, a abandoned house in some suburban neighborhood that hides some dark experiment. Our world, and how we perceive it, is part of the SCP toolbox. This is why the format, in my opinion, does not work well with fictional worlds. We can imagine being a researcher for the Foundation that just happens to be from Connecticut, for example. So when a sentence reads, "A swarm of human-devouring ants had been spotted near Connecticut," we can picture the situation. However, in this example, the carnivorous forest is growing exponentially and is expected to cover the area surrounding in the Medford province within the next 3 months. Now, this might be personal, but this last one is a big meh for me. I don't know any places in Medford. I don't know who lives there or what it looks like. This might be different when I am more familiar with its setting or world that involves the fictional characters that I am invested in. But in this case, it doesn't invoke any sense of, this could happen to me, or will they make it? In horror, familiarity is very important. It's no coincidence places like amusement parks, suburbs, schools, and other locations where we expect to feel safe are often the settings for horror stories. Personally, I found the SCP Foundation most engrossing when I just happened to come across some of their stories. One of the first stories I heard was about a human-devouring school bus, and the very disturbing SCP-2852, Cousin Johnny. And it was because I wasn't familiar with all the lore surrounding the SCP Foundation. I didn't know the tropes and references at the time, making it feel more mysterious and realistic. But that's just me. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something today. Let me know your thoughts on the SCP Foundation and your favorite SCP stories. And with that being said, I'm gonna wish you a very happy 2021, and as always, make it your way.